Hello, everyone. I hope you're all keeping well. Thank you for joining us this evening for this talk with composer Jeffrey Mumford, which is hosted by me, Miranda Cuckson, and presented by National Sawdust. We would like to start with a land acknowledgement. This event is being broadcast by National Sawdust, which is in Williamsburg, Brooklyn, and I am currently in Tannersville, New York, and Jeffrey is in Oberlin, Ohio. So we would like to state that we are broadcasting from the unoccupied and unceded territory of the Haudenosaunee, Mohican, and Erie people who have stewarded this land for generations. Please join us in acknowledging the Haudenosaunee, Mohican, and Erie communities, their elders both past and present, as well as future generations. National Sawdust also acknowledges our country was founded on exclusions and erasures of many indigenous and enslaved peoples. This acknowledgement demonstrates a commitment to beginning the process of working to dismantle the ongoing legacies of settler colonialism and genocide. So this is a conversation between Jeffrey Mumford and myself. I'm Miranda Cuckson. I'm a violinist and violist, educator, programmer, presenter, and I'm very involved in music, in general, contemporary music. Jeffrey and I have known each other for about a decade, which we'll talk about, the various collaborations we've had. So I will go ahead and introduce him. Also for those who are visually impaired who are joining us, I have dark hair, cut short, wearing a black top, and I'm sitting against a blue and gray wall background. So so please join me in welcoming Jeffrey Mumford to our talk.
Hello, I'm Jeffrey Mumford. And I'm very pleased to be here and thank National Sawdust and its staff and Miranda and Shireen and everyone for making this possible to share a discussion of music and ideas. For those who cannot see, I'm an African-American male with gray hair everywhere and wearing a black sweater.
Great. Well, it's so nice to see you, Jeffrey, even virtually. It's been a while.
It's always good to see you.
Yeah. So we've worked together for a while now. We also have a new piece that we're about to share with the world. So maybe I'll just start off by mentioning that Jeffrey wrote me a new work for solo violin called Fleeting Cycles of Layered Air. That I actually just filmed at National Sawdust some days ago, and it's part of the From concerts presented by Harvard University, which unfortunately had to be canceled in their live form this year because of COVID. I was very honored to be asked to co-curate with Anne Schroeffler there. But they did ask me to film this recital, so I'm delighted to get to share again some of Jeffrey's music with the world. And so please join us for that event, which is April 16th, 8 p.m. Maybe we'll get to talking about that specific piece a bit later, but we've worked, since 10 years ago. I guess you and I met through some mutual acquaintances, and you wrote first a piece for me called Through a Stillness Brightening, which is me with the Argento Ensemble. You have actually written quite a bit of string music, so I've also played a number of your works that were not written for me, but that I've also played and recorded.
Played wonderfully, by the way.
Well, thank you, Jeffrey. Well, I've of course, really enjoy your music, so I just keep on doing it and exploring it. Delighted to have a new piece of yours. So there are a number of things I thought we'd talk about in terms of your work and your inspirations. you take a lot of inspiration from nature and from visual art. And I would say certainly your music, I mean, you certainly have found your own, shall I say, style or language, whatever things you want to call it. I mean, there's definitely a Mumford piece, even though they have different moods. They do different things, and to me, the way they form themselves as they go on, and the kind of sound world that you have, yeah, has a special quality that I think certainly relates to those inspirations you have from nature and yeah, other types of art. But I thought before talking quite about that, I just wanted to just talk about you and your feelings about being an American composer and an African American composer, because that's just such a kind of pressing issue just in our society, yeah. And it just seems like it has become such a blatantly obvious point of crisis and contention, and an issue that's really preventing certainly this country from reaching its potential and moving forward. And so it's just kind of behooves us to talk about this. I was thinking, Jeffrey, actually early on in our work together, I was remembering there was a time that I think you and I were applying for a grant of some kind. I don't remember what it was exactly. And the parameters of the grant were quite general. But I remember that I wrote on there in my letter or something, Jeffrey Mumford, African-American composer. And you actually said something at the time like, well, I don't really want to just be called an African-American, but can it just say I'm a composer? And I remember at the time I just felt like, well, first of all, I think it's great to support American composers and then also African American. So I think we left it in. But I certainly understand or feel the same way often, like, can't we all just be doing what we're doing without these labels in terms of our background and origins? And I know you feel that way. But just to talk a bit about your particular background and your feelings about it. So I know you're from Washington, D.C., and you grew up in a household that did have a lot of different kinds of music in it. And you certainly don't hear those in your work in a very obvious way, but I think you have said to me that there are certain things that might be in there. So do you want to talk a bit about that?
Well, of course, yes, thank you. I'll have to give a shout out to my father, who passed away 2 years ago, for introducing me to a lot of terrific music. As a child, in the basement was where the stereo was. We would play all kinds of music. He had a huge Count Basie collection, and I got to know almost everything Count Basie's done. The records would stack from the floor to the ceiling 3 times over. In addition to jazz singers, Dinah Washington and Gloria Lynn, and of course, the divine Sarah Vaughan, I got an early music education, hearing these amazing musicians. And what I particularly loved with regard to those singers, they often sang with very large string sections, which gave me a sense of this lush sound that's possible in writing for strings. Later on, turns out my first composition teacher was a violist who thought that a composer should have a functional knowledge of basic string technique. And so he taught me viola to a certain extent. So I played functional viola, but I owe him a great deal for that. Because I love writing for strings, and I love, as I said, the sound possibilities therein. And so he also introduced me to the first recording I ever heard of the Emperor Concerto with Clifford Curzon, a British pianist, and Handel's Messiah with the Mormon Tabernacle Choir and Cast of Thousands in the Philadelphia Orchestra. Only later on, when I started working at a record store in New York, when I was historical performance became much more prevalent, did I hear how the Messiah should sound, because we were all laboring with this cast of thousands, like Daryl F. Zanuck kind of overdoing it. And then hearing the Pagabal canon, which is again overexposed and over orchestrated, and then hearing it was really written for 3 violins in continuo. You hear these pieces very differently later on. But growing up, I felt like I could walk into these pieces. I had a sense of walking into the sound of this music. And we'd go on for long drives and listen to the time, this was be the middle 60s, sort of a local AM radio station hosted by a radio host named Felix Grant, who brought bossa nova, and mostly the format was playing short pieces, but he played full albums. He called it the album sound, which was very rare at the time. So I got to know the music of Jobim a great deal, and that also had an influence on me. It's hard to parse these things out. I leave it for the musicologist later on to decide how, where, and how much of it is in my work, but it's there. I mean, the voicings of chords, as I said, the idea of this lush texture, things that are shifting. This is where the idea of clouds comes in, and the idea, my inspiration of clouds and light, the idea of clouds shifting and splitting apart, recombining. In growing up in Washington in the summertime, particularly, the thunderstorms could be very dramatic, and the sky would often turn purple and green, and I just would stare out the window, just in awe and loving what I saw. So the structure of my work often deals with these kinds of foreground, background, and middle ground areas. If that makes sense, hopefully.
Yes, for sure. So it seems like your natural inclination, even though you grew up, you were more drawn just to the sound worlds itself than any particular like cultural or societal connotations of African-American music as you knew it then. Is you were more just the sound itself and what it was doing.
Yeah, it was the music that was around. I mean, we trimmed our Christmas tree to Ramsey Lewis, an African-American jazz pianist, fabulous pianist. Ray Charles was in the house all the time. I mean, these people were living in our house with us. These were.
Yeah, right. That's great. Yeah, and so, well, do you want to talk a bit about then just your musical path then in terms of, yeah, I mean, you're very much your own self, and you have your own character in your music, but yeah, other figures from more contemporary music that were important to you in any way?
Well, certainly my first composition teacher, as I said, who set me on the path to, he took me under his wing after I originally enrolled in college to be a painter. And I guess my work is very visual. I take that very seriously as well. And then music kind of took over after one of my paintings was sabotaged by somebody. I don't know how or why. Then I started just becoming more aware that music was the way that it best expressed what I had to say. And so I was kind of taken under the wing by this composer, Peter Ortegard, who's also passed, who was a pupil of Roger Sessions. And for those who don't know Roger Sessions' music, it's very thick music. It's very passionate music, very expressive music. And so he allowed me to develop my own voice. I used to write music in different styles to develop techniques. I used to write little short pieces in the style of Schumann, working my way up through Stravinsky and through eventually Carter, who was a major influence on me. I had the privilege of studying with him for 3 years privately in his studio in New York, and I cannot tell you what an honor that was to have him.
Down in the Village.
Believe in me, yes, in the Village.
Yeah.
31 West 12th Street.
Yes, yeah, I heard he lived there, yeah.
Yeah.
That's great. Yeah, I certainly hear in your music, yeah, with speaking of both Sessions and Carter, the layering of things moving at different speeds, which you mentioned clouds, which I know is a major subject for you. Yeah, just with any sorts of objects or beings, these layers of movements at different times, I definitely hear that in your music, in your own way. Yeah, so it seems to me these two big subjects for you, nature and visual art. I was thinking about, this kind of like solace we get from both of those, it's like, I, I think it's something, nature of course is something besides that, we just can admire the beauty of it or the whatever sorts of immediate pleasures, but it's like, it takes you outside of yourself into this whole, the wholeness of the world that you're in. And visual art, any art, of course. I think we're also such visual creatures. I think there's something also about putting yourself into this other, scene or world that you're seeing is also kind of like you sort of leave yourself and go into this other thing. So I was thinking about these kind of two twin passions of yours. And in nature, you have many, many beautiful titles in your works. They very often have words relating to either clouds or light, right?
Yes.
And I was thinking also actually about both of those, that something that I think manifests itself in your music a lot is a sense of gradual processes. Certainly there are also often things that happen suddenly, chords that burst out or loud pizzicato, but then when you have all these layers that are moving, there's often a sense of gradual change and metamorphosis, which seems to be related to how light develops or clouds as you watch it in the sky. What do you think?
Oh, no, I hear that, and I draw an analogy to Monet, who very famous pictures over the course of periods of time of the cathedral and the haystacks, and how light would hit them at different times of day. And I would remember growing up as a child how light would come in through a window and work its way and move its way across the wall to the floor. And even today, now when I go for a walk, watching as the seasons change, where the sun rises behind this house, as the sun moves toward the north. And it fascinates me to see how this changes. In my work, I like to have dialogues between groups of instruments. In the case of a solo piece, dialogue between registers, highs and lows, and motives. And the sense of one thing that Nadia Boulanger, who's one of Carter's teachers, principal teacher, the idea of the grand line, even no matter how complex the texture is, no matter how complex the structure is, there's always a sense of a line. And I strive for that in my work as well. Have a sense of ebb and flow and elasticity.
Yeah, I can certainly hear that. You certainly have some long sections that kind of sort of unspool themselves. Yeah. Do you I was wondering, do you spend some of your days just like looking out the window
Yes.
and
yeah. I do. And as I say, going out for walks and just looking up at the sky.
Yes, yeah. It's funny, actually, I have kind of the same in New York. When I got my current apartment, I'm on the 17th floor, and I grew up in the city, but I had always said one sort of dream for me when I had my own place was to have a good view of the sky. And I have that now. And sometimes I'm just sitting there, I just watch.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's a beautiful show. It's a beautiful show.
Yeah. Great. So, Yeah, so you mentioned your start in visual art, that you actually started out as was it primarily in painting or not sculpture, right? Or
Painting.
yeah. So, yeah, I don't know if you want to tell me more about that incident with the.
Sure. Actually, I grew up in DC, which has the National Gallery, and one of the wonderful things about being in DC is that most of the museums, the Smithsonian museums, are free. And in high school, I practically lived at the National Gallery, and they have one of the most amazing collections, particularly of 17th century Dutch landscapes and Impressionists. And one of the first pieces that made a major impact on me was a painting by a Dutch painter named Albert Cuyp, Cuyp, View of Dordrecht. Because Holland is a low-lying country, the canvases that were painted by the landscape painters, such as Van Ruysdael and Hoberman, were three-fourths full of clouds. And so that attracted me a great deal. Seeing how this land was formed and the composition of the paintings was informed by this relationship of the low-lying land and the sky and it's juxtaposition. So then also they have an amazing collection of Cézannes, and Cézanne's work to me made Impressionism sculptural, and it may not make sense to you, or I hope it does, but I liken Cézanne to Brahms in a certain way, in that there's a certain monumentality of form in both of those approaches to the work. Brahms coming out of this tradition, Schumann and Cézanne coming out of the Impressionist tradition. His work in making two-dimensional painting almost three-dimensional.
Yes. Right. So so are Cézanne and Monet, would you say those are two favorites of yours?
They're very definitely, absolutely.
Yeah. 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 Are there any artists, or do you follow like today's artists much, or you tend to like stick to certain favorites?
Well, I live with one of today's artists, my wife,
Yes.
Donna.
Yes.
Sorry.
Should definitely mention Donna Coleman.
Oh, Donna Coleman.
Jeffrey's wife.
She does.
How's she been doing through the pandemic? Has she been?
She's actually had a number of shows actually. And the gallery spaces are limited, so they only allow a certain number of people into the shows at each time. But she's downstairs as we speak, busy painting. She has another show coming up.
Terrific.
In a month, and she does all my CD covers.
Yes.
If I didn't ask her, she'd probably change the locks on the door in the house so I couldn't get in. But
they're beautiful. Yeah.
I think she's doing her best work right now, actually. Yes, and her work comes from a tradition that she loves, from Bosch through surrealism to just a commentary on contemporary events. Certainly, today's relationship of racial issues, dealing with you go to a park and you see a bunch of nannies in the park. The nannies are often of color and they're strolling white babies, and there's a story behind that. And my daughter just told me today that one of her neighbors, she lives in Atlanta, my daughter, that the house next door is this big mansion, and the owners have a certain sense of entitlement to them, and she was very upset, my daughter, but the fact that they had this maid, this woman working for her, this very elderly Black woman with knee braces, having to do heavy labor, where this family has very able-bodied young sons who could easily do this labor. And my daughter's very outraged. She's very committed to social justice, and she's working with an organization that works with it's called Partnership for Southern Equity, and helping people who cannot have access to proper resources. Very proud of her work.
Wow. Great. Yeah, maybe maybe we should mention that your wife Donna is white. In fact, yeah. So your daughter's mixed. Yeah. Um, yeah. Also, yeah, you mentioned the National Gallery, which I know is a place that remains dear to your heart. And we actually did a concert there a few years ago now. I forgot what year exactly.
2013, I had a 3-week residency there.
Yeah, that was wonderful. So it was, I mean, it's a wonderful place just to play, but because it has such a personal meaning for you, it was like a really special thing to be part of. And two of the pieces that I played on that concert ended up on your album. Through a Stillness Brightening, which was a piece I mentioned at the beginning that you wrote for me and Argento Ensemble, and the solo piece and Expanding Distance of Multiple Voices. That's right?
Yes.
Title, yeah. So yeah, so that was very exciting and yeah, very inspiring to play your music in that kind of milieu and being able to have such a direct kind of inspiration from the art around you.
Well, it's very special for me too, to have you be part of it.
Oh, thank you. It was also great space acoustically, I think. You talk about the resonance that you loved since your childhood. I think that really came across in that. Yeah, so well, also I was going to mention you. So recently you wrote a wonderful short essay, I guess you call it, for the National Endowment for the Arts blog. They were asking, I think it was like 5 or 6 artists to write about what you considered to be good trouble, which is, of course, a reference to the great John Lewis and all the good trouble he raised for voting rights. So you wrote a really, really wonderful bunch of paragraphs about that, which had a number of great quotes in it. But maybe one that I'll just read a few sentences from right now. You said, "I believe that the artist must be a citizen aware of the context in which they live, both politically and culturally. Then they must define their own world with frames of reference unique to themselves and invite people into that world at appropriate times. As an artist, I am trying to create an alternative reality in my work, my own heaven, because too much of the world we live in is not welcoming." And the other day you and I also were talking, and you were talking about, yeah, kind of evoking another way of being. I think those were the words that you used. So, I mean, you mentioned again, like the social, racial issues we have in this country, which kind of plague all our interactions every day. So I think, I mean, it's tied also to your evocations of nature again, and being able to connect yourself to other things besides all the problems that we humans have. But do you want to talk about like this sense of alternate reality and how that kind of propels you in writing?
Sure. I also want to go back to a little bit of the inspirations that I took as a young Black composer. There was a series that came out in the 70s, recorded on Columbia Records, Columbia Black Composers Series, where I was introduced to the works of George Walker and Ollie Wilson, 2 composers I have great esteem for and have the privilege of getting to know. And I realized that I wasn't the only one who was hearing this kind of music, and there are people who looked like me writing this kind of music, and it made a very big impression on me. And so it was reissued, and the canon definitely needs to be expanded, and I'm very hopeful that consciousness is having been raised, that it will be accelerated. It needs to be accelerated.
Yes.
There are many voices out there that need to be heard, and many different kinds of voices. I mean, there's no one kind of Black music anymore. There's one kind of Black music or white music or Asian music or any other kind of music. We all write from our experience. There's that very famous Virgil Thompson response when asked, "What is American music?" His response was, "Any music written by an American." What is Black music? I say it's any music written by a Black person. Who else's experience could it be from but
It
their own?
couldn't possibly be otherwise.
Right. Exactly.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's so important. It's definitely, as you say, accelerating. And I think both in terms of uncovering some of those who have been neglected in the past, even George Walker, who like actually received tremendous accolades, and but it seemed kind of to no avail in some way during his own lifetime. But I'm glad people are playing and hearing more of his music, and of course for the younger generations.
It certainly took him long enough. Once you read his, one wants to read his autobiography, you would get a sense of the struggle it took.
Yes, I know he had a very hard time. Yeah. Yeah, I think, yeah, there was something I was going to say. Well, anyway, oh yes, I know. Just what you're saying about there's no one way. I think this idea of liberation and being free from this kind of the constraints of this reality we're in, or people are trying to put constraints on other people a lot of the time. But a lot of it is just about freedom to make your own choices, right? It's not about like, well, we should be writing this certain kind of music because we're from this. I mean, it's all valid, and so it's simple, very simple. And anyway, it's just being able to make those choices and identify for yourself what those are, right?
I was going to say, addressing your question about alternative realities. I mean, there is a tradition in African American culture of flying, of people escaping, creating their own reality. I reference Sun Ra as an example of the ultimate escape from this plane in space. His line, "Space is the place." I recently have a recent album of his where there is one of the pieces is about spaceships taking off for Venus, you know, and Jupiter winds, wait for me, and what is the color of the resonance and the vibration of space, and who are you, and who are we, and so I find that also very, very fascinating and intriguing and inspiring.
Yeah, right. Those various ways of using your imagination to escape. It could be escape, or you could be actually inventing a potential new reality, right?
That's what I want. Yes.
Yeah, and even space is becoming more of a reality, right? Yeah. We landed on Mars and everything. But yeah, so yeah, so I also wanted to talk to you a bit about, yeah, I mentioned the younger generation a moment ago, but just, I know you teach a lot, have throughout much of your life, I believe. Yeah, I also teach. So that's kind of like just a part of being an artist, and passing on what you learned, and generations being inspired by each other, and so on. But what are the most important things that you try to get across to students, and again in the context of the issues we're living in now?
Well, presently I'm teaching 2 sections of music appreciation and 1 section of humanities, which we are allowed to focus on areas of that we have personal experience. And so I teach focusing on music and art. And the textbooks that were assigned, I felt were woefully inadequate. Specifically the music appreciation textbook hardly talks about any composers of color at all, and when they do, they give it very short shrift. Only the most recent volume discussed William Grant Still in any kind of substantive way. And also women, the editions I've taught through 4 editions of this particular text, and the first one had Kaya Sarayaho, who they discussed to some extent for a while, and then the next edition she was replaced by Tania Leon. And one of the representatives came to my office, and we were talking, and I said, I don't understand why you couldn't have a both and world. Why couldn't you have Kaya Sarayaho and Tania Leon? And then later on, they introduced discussion of Ruth Crawford Seeger, a very fascinating and forward-looking composer in her own right, brilliant. And I believe in a both and world, but somehow the editorial crew decided they had to replace one with the other.
Just one.
Yeah.
Wow.
So I want our students to feel like the music that I'm presenting to them, a lot of which is very unfamiliar to them, is they have as much right to this music as anyone else. This music is no one owns it, no one has hegemony over it. It is out there for everyone. So give yourself permission to take this music into your soul and hear it.
Yeah. Do you encourage them to listen broadly?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And I assign things broadly. I mean, as I said, since the textbook doesn't have a lot of the composers that I think are very important for them to know, I use my own research. There's no discussion of the Chevalier de Saint-Georges, for instance, who was considered at the time the Black Mozart, French composer, known equally well almost for his fencing skills as a conductor, composer, and keyboard player. Jose White, Cuban, Afro-Cuban composer who lived in France, one of the foremost virtuosi of his time in the mid 19th century. I play his concerto. And I have to give a shout out to Rachel Barton Pine, who has championed this music and has recorded it.
Quite a while, right?
Yes, for a while. So we wouldn't have this music if it weren't for her and musicologists who have unearthed these pieces. And I discuss also William Grant Still and Eric Dolphy, a composer who is uncategorizable, who studied with Severino Gazzoloni, Italian avant-garde flutist at the time, who championed the works of Berio and Boulez. And in his own work, it's very avant-garde, quote unquote, abstract, jazz / classical. The boundaries are blurred. The piece is in sonata form, actually, but the themes and the way they were improvised upon are incredibly fascinating. And I want the students to hear this.
Great.
As well as Tania Leon's music as well.
Yes, she's a marvelous composer also. So I think maybe let's talk a bit about the pieces. So we're going to play a short, an excerpt from one of your violin pieces for our audience now. And then just to mention again, I have to get a little plug in there again, but we're having a world premiere on April 16 of Fleeting Layers of Cycled Air. Did I say that right? Fleeting Cycles of Layered Air. It sounded wrong somehow. Oh, there we go. Yeah, maybe very briefly, do you want to say a few words about that piece?
I guess the idea of the fleeting cycles of layered air builds upon the kinds of things I like to do, where there are several layers of registral activity, very high passage work, middle ground, more legato, cantabile, and soprano cello playing close to the bridge, creating a very kind of glassy sound in the lower register. And I wanted to give the sense of several things evolving and cycling as the piece unfolds.
Yeah, I found the piece also has a lot of, I mean, this whole evocation of air, it's a lot of very fluttering, feathery sounds. And then also the sense of distance, something sound very far away and suddenly they're right in, like in front of your face. So, so we're excited to share that on April 16. And now we're going to, we thought it's good to hear some actual music. So this is eight musings, right?
8 musings.
Eight musings revisiting memories.
Yes.
So this is a solo violin piece by Jeffrey. This is my performance. This was actually in that National Gallery concert that we talked about. But this one is not on the album that came from that. So this is, I think, we're going to do 3 of the movements.
Yeah.
For a few minutes. So yeah, so Charles, if you could play us that recording. Thank you.
think that's.
Should we stop there? Yeah, so that was an excerpt from 8 Musings Revisiting Memories. That was, yeah, part of that piece. When was that written, Jeffrey?
2005.
Yeah, it's a wonderful one. It's great to hear it again. I have to play that again.
It's nice to hear it. You play it. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, so I think we're going to move on to a bit of Q&A, and I think we have a question from our viewers. They would like to join us. Hello, Inti.
Hello.
Hi.
Hi, can you see and hear me?
Yes. Great. Thank you for
Amazing.
joining.
No problem. Thank you for the talk. It's been really wonderful so far. And it's been amazing to hear your music, Jeffrey. That piece was really beautiful.
Thank you.
I was just, I kind of so rarely meet, I don't mean to say other composers from DC, but as, you know, kind of as someone who grew up in DC, it's been amazing to, yeah, also hear music, yeah, in Mount Pleasant.
Oh, neat.
And yeah, so I kind of had like an initial question even before we started, which was just kind of about if you had any kind of particular musical memories tied to any particular space in DC. I know I do. But the other question, kind of thinking about clouds a little bit, was just your conception of the use of kind of negative space, like the, you know, the canvas of sky, and how that kind of creates pictures as well. So yeah.
Well, thanks for the question. More and more, I'm incorporating silences as structural elements in the works, and what you're saying about negative space, feel the silences play as an important role as the actual notes, and the idea of the space between branches of trees and how the light comes through the trees from the sky. There's a piece of a string quartet called In Forests of Evaporating Dawns, which deals with, you walk through a forest, how the light filters through the trees as you walk past them.
That's beautiful. Do you mind if I ask a follow-up question? I know that just also through the experience of almost just like listening to this piece on this stream, I mean, I think in my mind, you know, silence in a space where we can't see the performer or in a recording, you know, I feel like maybe there's a different quality sometimes to when you're in the room. And I guess I just like reflecting that that's probably affected my own music a little bit. I think it's maybe a little fuller or a little bit more something. Just wondering if that's, you know, if that's felt, yeah, anywhere in there.
I guess I'm sorry.
Oh, I'm sorry. Yeah, that was kind of half a question. I guess just wondering whether, like, yeah, the use of negative space or silence or rest or anything has been affected by remoteness at all.
By remoteness, interesting question. I hadn't really thought about it that way. It has evolved as my language has evolved. Perhaps living in a more rural area here, that might have something to do with it. That's a good question. I think of it more, though, in a way of trying to create, in ways the same we talking about before, another layer of, and so things have a greater sense of profile when set against that.
Beautiful. Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you.
I also find, I mean, I don't know what you say, Jeffrey, but just the sense of resonance in your music. You seem conscious of, yeah, the vibrations going into space, and on strings, you definitely use a lot of open strings. Like there's a lot of double stops, of course, if there's often an open string in there, which gives it, and I feel like that use of the silence also, like knowing that that's going to be filling the, both time-wise and, as you've mentioned, Inti live, like you have that sense of it's coming across the space toward you. I don't know. Am I right, Jeffrey?
Well,
This
yeah, open strings definitely have a greater resonance. It's true, and
is a kind of, certainly a brightness, but a kind of
yeah.
body to your sound.
Well, the solo piece that's on the CD that you recorded, Expanding Distance of Multiple Voices, starts out with open strings, and then increasingly distances and other notes are added to it, but it always comes back to that the sound of the G, D, A, E, and then G, D, A, E, B flat, and then B flat, C, and then it comes back in other movements in different forms. But the piece is based pretty much on that resonance.
Yeah. Great. Well, thank you, Inti, for that question. I think we're going to wrap up soon. Jeffrey, just one last question. What do you, yeah, in the big picture, what would you like people to take from your music, or what do you want to leave behind you with your music? No.
All right. Like 25 words or less. I hope I take my listeners on a journey that takes them to a place they haven't been, but once they get there, they could have gotten there no other way.
That's beautiful. Yeah. Yeah, so we're gonna have a little mingle afterwards for any of you who are here, want to hang out virtually a bit, so please join us. Yeah, when we log off here, but I want to thank National Sawdust for hosting this and their whole series of talks and events through this year, and for having Jeffrey. And Jeffrey, it's great to see you.
Good to see you too.
It was a pleasure.
Thank you, Inti, as well. Thank you for everyone
Thank you, Inti. Yeah.
participated and joined us here. It was great to have the opportunity to share a bit of what I do and with you.
Yes, please, everyone, check out more of Jeffrey Mumford's music, and yeah, and join us again on April 16th for a new piece by him.
Thank you.
So thank you, Jeffrey. Thank you all.
Thanks, everyone.